So good morning, everybody. Welcome to this joint Pinsent Masons and Landmark Chambers seminar. And today's subject is digital planning. It's great to see so many of you joining this seminar. My name is Nicholle Kingsley, and I'm a partner at Pinsent Masons, and I head up our London planning team and will be the chair for today's discussion. I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of expert speakers. But before I introduce the speakers to you, there are, I'm afraid, few housekeeping points to cover, and I appreciate a number of you will have heard these many times before, but I'll run through them quickly. So don't worry about your microphones because they are automatically muted, so you don't need to adjust any of the settings. We do, and particularly in this session, welcome any questions throughout the session. We'll leave it till the end to look at and answer the questions, but if you submit the questions, your Q&A button should be at the bottom of your screen. Now, we hope we can answer as many of the questions as possible, but if we aren't able to do so, we will try and follow up after the event to answer each of the questions that we don't get to. Now, please note the webinar will be recorded and we'll send you a link to the presentation and the recording shortly after the event concludes. Don't worry if your connection is lost at any point during the webinar. You should be able to just rejoin the meeting using the original link. So, topic for today, digital planning. And I guess really the first question on this is, well, what do we mean by it? Funnily enough, as we all do nowadays, what I did was I Googled digital planning. And actually the first one that you come to is an idiot's guide to putting your diary onto the computer. Now, I'm not sure if that reflects the planning system at the moment, but it does indicate how quickly things change in this area. And indeed, this was quite clear, wasn't it? Right from last year on the first lockdown back in March, and then we saw very quickly the government reacting to change some primary legislation. And what that did was enabled large parts of the planning process and the development regime to continue during the lockdown period. And we'll hear a bit more about this a bit later. We saw, for example, a change to the legislation which enabled virtual planning committee meetings and for electronic issue of documents and consultation processes. And we also saw a bit later that the Land Registry started to accept electronic signing and the courts moving to virtual hearings. And then slightly later, the Planning Inspectorate dealing with virtual hearings. And we now have the hybrid position where they're able to combine written representations, hearings and inquiries. Now, this last change has actually been made permanent, but not all of the other changes have been. And arguably, those changes actually still don't reflect 21st century and where we can actually get to. And we should, I think, have a planning system that's brought up to the 21st century and beyond to improve not just efficiency in the planning process, but also costs. However, it's not just about the planning process, is it? And the digitalisation of the way we determine planning applications. Digital planning is about so much more than that. And it can cover the way we use and process data, the way we respond to advances in technology, such as, for example, smart buildings and cities. And it has the ability to fundamentally and radically change the way that we actually view our built environment. Unfortunately, because this is such a vast topic, we're not going to be able to cover everything today, but we do hope to provide an interesting overview. Now, I am fortunate today, as I mentioned earlier, to have with me to help with the discussion some very talented and expert lawyers. And they're going to offer you their thoughts on this really interesting topic of discussion. So firstly, Dr. Sue Chadwick. So Sue is a strategic planning advisor at Pinsent Masons and a planning law specialist who's worked for both the private sector and local government on a range of developments in and out of London. Sue combines her commercial work with a very active academic interest in the subject. She not only has a PhD in planning law, but she's also written 2 books on the subject, Planning Decisions and Neighbourhood Plans. Sue is currently a research fellow with the ODI working on data and planning decisions and is also a member of the RED Foundation Steering Group on Digital Ethics, Property and Planning. So Sue is going to provide us with an overview of the principal points on digital planning, where this began, and what we may be moving towards, as well as a few thoughts on various issues along the way. We also have with us today Zack Simons, a leading planning barrister at Landmark Chambers. Zack's practice focuses on housing infrastructure, commercial development and compulsory purchase work, and he appears regularly in planning appeals and inquiries and hearings, local plan examinations and court hearings in the High Court, Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. Zack acts for a wide range of developers, including some of the UK's leading house builders and land promoters, along with central government and many local authorities. So Zack is going to provide us with his thoughts as to how the planning system has changed recently and his experiences of the advantages and potential disadvantages of these changes from virtual committee meetings, appeals and the court system. So thank you all again for listening, and we do hope that you find this discussion as interesting as we all do. So turning first to Sue, over to you, Sue.
Hello, Nicholle. This is the point we all dread when we're giving a Zoom, when you have control of the slides. So hello, everyone. And here we go with digital planning, a few thoughts. 1947, two things happened. Well, a number of things happened, but two things happened that are relevant to digital planning. Firstly, Alan Turing gave one of his first lectures ever to the London Maths Society, introducing something he called the automatic computing engine. And this was basically at a time when a computer was a female, usually, inputter of data. Nobody had ever thought of a computer as something electronic. He was saying you can make this computer electronic, and he said the possibilities are endless. He also said we'll need a number of efficient librarian types to keep us in order, which I like to think of as us lawyers back now down the line with digital planning. But also in 1947, as anybody involved with planning is aware, the first Modern Planning Act was made. And it leaves us with a problem, I think, in terms of digital planning, which is the idea that land is a corporeal hereditament. That sounds so old-fashioned, doesn't it? And the problem is it's corporeal, it's physical. We have no notion, we still have no notion of digital development. Fast forward to 2021, computers are everywhere. We carry them in our pockets. And the government, in its response to the Building Better, Building Beautiful report, acknowledged that digital technology can and should transform the way in which the planning system operates. And also acknowledged that this could allow for automation, which means artificial intelligence. And they also said greater use of digital tools could improve the quality of local engagement. So things have really moved forward in terms of both the idea of digital planning and the idea of automation and computers generally. The problem, I think, one of the big problems is that we don't have an updated notion of what land is. And I think that encourages a view of planning that ignores the digital. And my question really is, are we ready to jump from 1947 to 2021? So I'm going to very briefly run through a few things. Firstly, what we might mean by digital planning, and then introduce something which I think people tend not to think about, which is that actually we already have an information data management regulatory framework. And then I'm going to look at the areas where the emerging technologies will disrupt those frameworks and the legal risks that could come out of it. Things like, how do we reconcile smart consultation with the common law principles that are established in the Gunning case? How do we deal with the computer making decisions? Are they still interpretable? And what about things like algorithmic bias and the right to a private life? How are they impacted by digital planning? And then at the very end, I'll start a topic that I think Zack and Nicholle will be able to pick out in their presentations and questions. Where do we start making changes to bring this future forward? What is digital planning? Well, it's a bit like sustainable development back in the 1990s. We're all using the term, but there's no legal or formal definition. And what it means tends to depend on who is using the actual term. And it can, at a very basic level, as we've all found, mean that you simply take an electronic version of something you would have put in paper previously. Things like site notices are now almost exclusively digital. Things like electronic engagement, that's one step further forward in sophistication. And then you get really whizzy with, you start populating documents and processes with real-time information on things like air quality and possibly even biometrics in a COVID world. Automated processes and predictive tools based on machine learning, that's really where we are already with things like health technology, and it's not really long before buildings are going to be like that too. And then the one that we may be aware of, particularly if we're in a construction background, the idea that a twin might exist, a digital twin might exist, both of an individual building, but also the ecosystem or the digital ecosystem of a city, where the buildings merge with the environment, the infrastructure, and even the humans in the digital world. So currently, we're replacing paper documents with electronic machine readable versions. We're replacing paper notices with electronic ones, physical with digital service, physical with digital deposit. We've got online meetings and hearings. We have drone footage, which is creating the virtual site visit. And we're using electronic methods for digital engagement, looking at the future as well as existing populations. And this is all something that we have done in the last year, which is an extraordinary leap forward. And I think something to be really quite proud of as a profession, particularly local authorities. I think we've all been surprised and pleased by how far local authorities have gone with this. But this is just where we are now. There's so much more that's going to change in the future. The digital twin is something that we are no longer going to be able to ignore if we're in planning, partly because it's going to allow things like repurposing so much easier, because we're going to be able to model what happens in a digital environment without committing to a physical change. But also, and if that's the carrot, this is the stick. The Hackett review after the Grenfell tragedy is going to result in the Building Safety Bill coming through to Parliament. And that is going to be the first legislation that says you must have a certain element of your development proposal put into data and maintained as a secure data cache through the life of the development. It's the beginning of digital planning as a regulatory requirement. And I think we're also going to see much more automation of processes. Things like calls for sites on local plans can be automated. Applications will be automated by an automated validation process. An increasing number of back office functions will be capable of automation across the board in local authorities. And increasingly, we're getting talk of digital environmental assessments. The planning white paper is the first planning policy document really to mention digital planning, and it has a number of different references. I'm not going to go through them all here because you can see it as much as I can, but you can see how many different ways in which the planning white paper anticipates the changes that are going to come through from digital planning. Everything from what we're already aware of, which is things like digital tools for civic engagement, which is e-consultation, right the way through to modernized modular software, digital co-creation platforms, and the interesting one, I think, prop tech sector, the new prop tech sector and where they're going to come in. So whizzing through these 6 slides, we're going to move from paper, and everybody involved in planning knows how paper heavy it is, through to this. This is an extract from the MHCLG Digital Land team, and it's their vision of how you can organise planning data. It's part of their notes on the changes they're making on development plan documentation. So you can see there just how different it is when you look at data architecture rather than papers. And here we are, a picture of the classic physical inspection of land by chaps in hard hats and high-vis vests. Obviously, a lot of that isn't possible at the moment, so it is increasingly likely that we're going to move to the drone. And if you could, there is already a project at the Centre for Digital Built Britain about using drone swarms for inspecting historic bridges. Now, they're doing it to look at the repair requirements for these historic bridges, But I do think in the future, much more of that kind of thing will be used both to monitor things like stresses on historic buildings, but also environmental impacts, drone footage of environmental impacts such as monitoring wildflowers, but also with edge technology, the more sensitive environmental sensing. And this is one we were chatting about before, whether or not we are actually going to move from physical through to virtual meetings. And there are so many benefits of the virtual meeting. This is probably what we don't want. Now, we all know these images from the Handforth Parish Council. And this is one of the dangers of digital planning, that you simply switch from an analog to a digital version of something, and you inherit all of the old problems and bring them with you. And in this case, the frankly rudeness of some members of a planning committee or a parish council meeting simply transfer into the digital world. So hopefully that is not what digital planning is going to mean. I said at the beginning, we already have an information regulation framework in planning, but it's not one framework, it's lots of different pieces of legislation. The DMPO, anybody in planning is aware of this, regulates a wide range of issues from pre-application submission to post-completion, all of it involving information management and all of it involving information requirements. Separately from that, we have the environmental information regulations, which define data in a very sophisticated way, including emissions, and give the public rights of access to that data. Then going back in time, the Local Government Act has its own data requirements, particularly Section 100, particularly Section 100D, which says that background papers for committee reports must be disclosed. And the Hoban Studios case last year, a whole permission fell because they hadn't complied with the requirement to put viability information out there for the public. So we already have ways in which data is regulated. And we have a wider regulatory framework. There's the GDPR. There is also two sets of information on the requirements to share public information on local authorities. There's the INSPIRE regulations, where spatial data sets must be made publicly available, and the reuse of public sector information regulations, which give the public another right to request public sector information so that they can reuse it. This is, I think, where it gets interesting, where you start to think about all the ways in which technology is changing and how that will crunch, if you like, with the current legislation. And the first one, I think, and the immediate one for everybody to get to grips with, is consultation. I think one of the things that's been really improved over the last year is e-consultation and the ability to reach so many more people so much more easily. And I think particularly the way that they're using smart consultation methods means that you can engage not just the community that's affected by the development that's there now, but you get the chance to harness the voices of the people who might live there in the future. And consultation has never been able to do that before. So it's, on the one hand, it has dramatically improved the scope of how you can engage the population on planning decisions. But unfortunately, at the same time, it has come at the expense of digital exclusion and discrimination, and increasing awareness that some sectors of the population are excluded from participation in planning because they don't have the digital tools. We tend to think this is associated with the older populations, but it's not just older populations. It can also be certain sectors of socioeconomic exclusion as well. And unfortunately, socioeconomic deprivation tends to go hand in hand with digital deprivation. And as I think we've mentioned a few times now, these changes, the digitalization of consultation, is a temporary change at the moment. We still don't know whether we're going to go forwards or backwards. Consultation, we have an existing legal framework that says, you've got the 2015 DMPO that says various things about who you consult and when, but underneath that you have these common law principles that say You must consult at a formative stage. You must have reasons, you must have adequate time, and you must take the product into account. And I think the more whizzy smart engagement apps and software run the risk of ignoring these principles. Indeed, the government itself has recently been criticised because it made some changes permanent, but it didn't consult before it made those changes permanent, and the scrutiny committee had some pretty strong words to say about the way that that was done. They particularly mentioned the lack of people who were digitally excluded from being able to be aware of and comment on these proposals. The second area, and I think most people are starting to grapple with this one now, is how you deal with all of this data, because you have an enormous awareness of the need to digitalize and how it benefits everybody. And I also think there's a lot of willingness to change out there in the system. But we don't really have the legislative tools. We have a statutory scheme for planning decisions that started in 1990. We have a legal framework for committee decisions that originated in 1972. And as anybody I've talked to in digital planning has said, with great despair, what we have in local authorities is a lot of non-machine readable PDFs. So you've got enormous data stores that can't be used in a beneficial way. The problem is that people say, this is just too hard. We've got enough on our plates. We can't digitize. And I think there are two risks there. Firstly, that too much of the planning function goes to the prop tech industry. So you might get approached by somebody saying, here's this whizzy app, here's this marvelous software, let me take all your problems away. And it may well do some things very smart, very fast. But if you're a local authority, you also have to have regard, particularly GDPR, cybersecurity, interoperability. You also have the issue of public trust. And I think that's something that maybe the prop tech industry doesn't have the background in. The recent report on the use of data during COVID-19, it was how local authorities use data in COVID-19, and they said everybody was concerned about data governance, but participants commented on how it was difficult to translate theoretical frameworks into practical steps. That's what we're missing at the moment. This is the really interesting one from my point of view. AI and machine learning. It is prevalent throughout everything we do on a simple level. I mean, the Google Translate function is artificial intelligence. In planning, it's a really good tool for improving the evidence base, I think, for complex decisions, especially those that rely on environmental data. Things like air quality, wildlife populations are so much more receptive to being monitored autonomously, and so much more rich data can be generated that way. I think there's a certain amount of heavy lifting that can be done in the planning function through AI, whether that's the back office functions or automated validation processes. And indeed, there are pilot studies on all of these things. I've mentioned a few people there. They are just the ones I've spoken to directly. All sorts of exciting things happening. It's a really powerful planning tool. But there are AI issues and there are AI legal issues. Because the technology is pervasive, you can kind of walk into a problem backwards, because you can be deeply embedded in the use of AI before you almost are aware of it. And there is an article of the GDPR that says you must not make a decision that is based on an automated process. There's a very real risk, I think, that we can walk backwards into non-compliance with Article 22. On a more academic level, I think it's becoming increasingly, or it will become increasingly possible to say, hey, you made your decision based on these air quality impacts, but these air quality impacts were assessed by a machine. Is that actually a valid decision? Or you run into the issues that the government ran into over the summer with the exam marking, which is this algorithm isn't really working, is it? This mutant algorithm idea. And there are two specific issues with AI. Firstly, human rights. This is particularly relevant with biometrics. We are, particularly again through COVID, lots of sophisticated technology has emerged, which looks at biometric information monitoring faces, fingerprints, speech gait, temperature, and these things are getting more sensitive all of the time. But in the background, there is already just the one case which says that if you use automated facial recognition, you engage and infringe Article 8, the right to a private life. This was the use by the police of automated facial recognition at sports events and I think one shopping centre. It went to the Court of Appeal, the decision was last September, and the Court of Appeal was very concerned about the way that the police had used automated facial recognition. If we are starting to use it in developments for very good reasons, such as preventing crime or managing traffic flow of people or security in schools and hospitals, we do have to be aware that Article 8 is there and you must have regard to it and build that regard into the decision. And then AI inequalities, which I think people are more aware of now because of the exam marking issues. First issue with equalities in AI is this digital divide and the idea of digital discrimination. The Environment Bill, which is going to come back onto the framework of legislation probably in May this year, actually has a definition of a digitally excluded person, the first one I've seen. And then we have the idea of the mutant algorithm. It isn't a mutant algorithm, it's a stupid human. It's poor data sets, it's badly trained data. But the problem is that if you, for example, buy software that has these problems built into it, you may not be able to go back to the software provider when the problems manifest themselves as discriminatory when it's used in practice. And so this is the way, this is the difficult bit, we could start to respond. We can't fix all the problems at once, but there are so many relatively easy ways that we could start now as a profession. And I think it actually starts with procurement of software. Whether you're procuring it to use as a council or you're procuring it to use in a development, whether you're the person who's going to be operating it or you're just buying in a firm to do it, I think it's really important to start thinking now about equalities considerations and the use of AI. Black box technology, the AI where nobody knows how it's made the decision, whether or not that's there and how it's being mitigated. And obviously cybersecurity and GDPR data privacy. I've seen a lot of apps promoted for new ways of doing planning. What I haven't yet seen is any decision by a local authority saying we're now using this software to do part or all of our planning function. And it may well be that we don't need those decisions yet, but as the use of software increases, I think it will be increasingly important to make the decision to use it something that is taken publicly with a consensus both of the members of the local authority and the public that it is being used to serve. My personal bugbear is both the GDPO and the DMPO. We should start making submission digital by default. At the moment, even now, the DMPO is based on a paper by default method with electronic, something that you agree separately. We really need to say, we go digital unless there's a reason not to. And I also think we need to start lobbying government to say, let's have one place where we start collecting all of this guidance on using digital tools. Let's have something in the NPPG on digital planning and particularly consultation. Again, with the DMPO, we need to be aware that land has a digital self. I know we're not likely to get a new definition of land that says it's not just corporeal, but we need to start thinking beyond the corporeal element of land. The DMPO could say, as well as having a design and access statement, you have a digital access statement. You say what your connectivity levels are going to be, so that you're building in your equalities considerations. And everybody's crying out for this, the DMPO simply says, these are the accepted data standards, you know, like the RICS data standard. Just say these are the ones that are acceptable to use, and then we don't have to argue about it. We need to start thinking of development as digital entities, and that could evolve into a digital twin that could merge with the information of a city to create a much more evolved, exciting digital animal, if you like. Compliance, it would be a shame if we do this by compliance alone. Yes, some information will need to be secured through law, but it will only be for some buildings, it'll only be some information. Wouldn't it be nice if we started an anticipatory compliance by starting to really manage the data associated with the development along with the development itself? And this one is a bit of a controversial one because the courts are firmly wedded to the idea of planning as something that's connected to physical land. Maybe we should start thinking about things like data management, data sharing, data for the public good as genuine planning benefits that can be taken into account as part of a development. Digital ethics. I think we do need to start becoming aware of both the benefits and the risks of the smart solutions. It would be great to see something in the NPPG that talks about this, how to overcome the issues of digital software, hardware, or professional services for planning purposes. And it would be nice again to see something in the NPPG just saying, these are the things you need to look out for in terms of operability, cybersecurity, data protection. And I think for AI, if you're using it to process the application or to help with your service level decisions or within individual decision making, I think there's an argument to say, let's put this into the normal equalities considerations. Let's just have a line on digital planning. And I just love this quote. He said it back in, I think, 1948, but it's so true today. We are still only grasping what digital planning can do, but we do know that there's plenty there to be done. Going into Zack's reflections.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Sue, very much. Really interesting. And we'll come back to discussion shortly. But before I did, I just wanted to ask Zack a question really in terms of, so from your experience really, Sue's mentioned and I mentioned in the introduction a number of changes over the past year as a result of the pandemic. How have you found the changes in the planning process? Just would you mind just giving us some of your experience and your views on fairly wide remit, obviously, of digital planning, but in terms of your experience of how you found it?
I've found the changes absolutely remarkable. So some of the changes that Sue's already reflected on, really interesting, Sue. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, and also that Nicholle mentioned in your introduction, Nicholle. A remarkable time, the last 12 months for the industry that I work in. The starting point for me is to reflect on what was going on before, say, March or so of 2020, so a full year ago. The system wasn't working very well, in a number of ways. Now, you wouldn't know it from the folks who have dialed into this webinar, but the number of us actually engaged with what the planning system's doing day to day is tiny, even though it's a system which affects all of our lives, of course. Now, why is that? I don't think it's so hard to fathom why that is. Most people have other things to do, families, work, some socially distanced exercise. More or less anything beats putting on a suit in the middle of a working day and trudging off to a freezing local council chamber somewhere to sit through hours of detail from other people in suits about highway modelling or viability or housing land supply before you're given, say, 3 minutes or whatever it is to say your bit to address members or to address planning inspectors, whatever it might be. Let's make sure my microphone's working okay. It doesn't sound too appetizing, does it? And what's worse is these processes can seem so shrouded in secrecy. What actually happens at a planning committee meeting, say, or a planning inquiry or a plan examination, isn't it a bit intimidating? Does it have anything to do with our lives? Where are the documents? Where are the important ones? How are we supposed to understand them in the unlikely event that we can find them? How on earth are we supposed to put in enough time aside to follow these events so that when it actually gets to our slot, we can actually assist the members or the inspector or whoever it might be by saying something useful that hasn't been said 100 times before? How do you even find out if there's an important local planning application? An email, a tweet, a Facebook post, aka somewhere that you might actually notice it? No, until March or so of last year, it was a good old-fashioned laminated printout pinned to a lamppost around the corner. Environmental statements, sustainability appraisals, those most overwrought and impenetrable of tomes, which can fill boxes and boxes, had to be printed out old school and lodged somewhere in the bowels of the council storage rooms. You want to see the full planning file, will make an appointment, and a council officer will bring you down a folder with loose bits of paper flying around, and you can try to make sense of it all. Of course, until the spring of last year. Planning in the UK until last March was an analogue system, which is creaking its way into a digital age. But what a change we've experienced since the spring. Our system has transformed, not just a little, a lot. It's a generational moment, I think. It's almost in a very sort of quiet UK kind of way, a bit of a revolution. And it's not the future, it's now, it's already happening. And my experience of it is that it's working for the most part. It's working very well. Now, some of it, but not too much, required legal changes. In early lockdown, you might remember, casting your minds back to last spring, some things happened really quickly. Within a few weeks, by the beginning of April, we had new regulations that allowed for local planning authority committee meetings to continue virtually. Hugely important, obviously, because without the ability to grant planning permissions, the rest of the system comes to a grinding halt. And almost immediately, literally within days, lots of councils, not all, of course, but lots, had taken up the baton of making decisions virtually, which meant that almost immediately the law allowed most of the key elements of the planning system to continue. There were some substantial roadblocks that took a little bit longer to fix. The regs covering things like environmental impact assessment, strategic environmental assessment, things like local plans, local plan consultations, all of those areas of the law required physical documents available to inspect somewhere at an address that obviously in lockdown was a non-starter. There were also questions about the extent to which applications could be consulted on and publicised fairly or lawfully under lockdown. Some of those matters were dealt with, though, by regulations in May that brought in more flexible ways of consulting and publicising on planning applications. And they also got rid of the requirement for EIA to be available in hard copy. And indeed, the same similar rules have come in since then that apply to local plans and to strategic environmental assessments. Now, the virtual local planning authority meeting regs expire in effect in May of 2021. Hugely important point, this one, because obviously we're at back end of February now, so it's not long. Now, the ministry thinks we understand that changes can only be made permanent in this area through primary legislation, and that there's no time for that to be affected before May, which is, to state the obvious, an enormous problem, because without those regulations, there's at least a chance that committee meetings grind to a halt. And there is a legal issue that may come before the courts over whether or not being quote unquote present at a meeting under the auspices of the Local Government Act 1972 could actually allow virtual meetings anyway. But that's a hotly contested debate. And this, more than any other area, is something we need clarity on. Clarity through clear legislation and ideally primary legislation. Some of the reforms, the points about hard copies of things like EIA, have now been made permanent, has been referred to already. Although that making permanent, as Sue mentioned, in itself was ironically done without consultation, so it's been criticised by the Scrutiny Committee. But lots of the other reforms that we've been through are due to expire in December of 2021. Now, so far as my work is concerned, it took a bit longer, but by the summer of 2020, planning appeals, planning examinations and court hearings were all up and more or less running virtually. And that has included, over the last few months, a number of big ticket plan examinations, some absolutely whopping great planning inquiries like the Tulip in the City of London, the UK National Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre inquiry in Westminster, which is a case where I appeared and supported the scheme. And at that one, we heard from 2 former prime ministers, the current and previous archbishops of Canterbury, chief rabbi, well over 50 interested parties from all over the world, including a number of unforgettable statements from Holocaust survivors, academics, historians. And that's in addition to the enormous teams of professional witnesses for all the main parties, including my client. You simply couldn't have done the inquiries as effectively as we were able to do it without the virtual running of the inquiry that enabled people to dial in, as I've said, from their front rooms. Every moment of it was streamed on YouTube. The videos are uploaded. They can be rewatched. Not only are they available, they actually have been rewatched hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. Our opening statements have now been viewed almost 5,000 times. Try fitting that many people into a council chamber. You want engagement? You want more people to participate and put their trust into the robustness of a process they can actually understand? Then I say, make it easier. Make it easier for people to check into an inquiry or an examination process when and how it suits them. That's what the Planning Inspectorate have now done. Didn't happen overnight, but they've got there in the end with some heroic support from their team, and I think it's working really, really well. And what does this show us? I think it shows us a few things. First, the Tulip or the UK Holocaust Memorial appeals, they were 2 of the most significant, high-profile and complicated appeals of last year. They involved engagement with and participation of all sectors of the public. They required and are still requiring detailed presentation and cross-examination on expert evidence at the highest levels. So here's the point. If these high-level appeals and inquiries can do it and do it well, so can all the others. And the same goes for plan examinations too, a lot like the South Oxfordshire plan examination last summer. Second point is that the processes aren't yet perfect. People are still acclimatizing to Microsoft Teams, the old technical hitch, of course, the interpersonal cues we miss from not being together in the same room. All of that can hinder the ebb and flow of these experiences. So we lose something, there's no doubt about it. But think about what we're gaining. The prize is massive. The real point of this is the capacity of virtual events to engage more people, far and wide, young and old, from all over the country. And there's no speculation required for any of that because it's happening. It's happening right now already. You know, the YouTube video numbers tell their own story. And I think, thirdly, the genie's out of the bottle, because lots of these changes have been precipitated by the requirements of lockdown, digital publicity and consultation, the things we've been talking about, virtual committee meetings, virtual appeals, DCOs, virtual plan examinations. But we know it works now, thanks to a huge amount of work by local authorities, a huge amount of work by the Planning Inspectorate, but we know it works now. Even for the most complicated schemes, the most complicated plans, it works in a way that's transparent, efficient, fair. And public engagement isn't just maintained, it's very dramatically enhanced. It would have taken decades without a lockdown, but for what it's worth, my view is that the last year has been enormously positive for helping to drag our system into the 21st century. Generally speaking, I think we need to guard that progress fiercely against those who would take it back. Nicholle, that's my overview. Back to you.
Thank you, Zack. Thanks, really interesting. And actually, if I could come to you first from the floor, because it was one that I had. We won't dwell too much on the sort of negatives, but it was a question for you, Zack, in terms of where do you think digital doesn't work? And it's kind of the question of, you know, what changes, I guess, haven't worked quite so well from your experience. So if we could just start on that one, and then I'll move to Sue with a few questions from the floor as well.
Something is lost in these virtual events. I think we all know that. Interpersonal cues, the flow of how an event works, team camaraderie if you're working as part of a team, as I normally am. And then, of course, the tech fails, which do happen. There are times when it can be very difficult to present the evidence you need to present virtually, using architects' models and things like that to make a building come to life, or whatever it might be. There's also really important point that Sue has referred to, the digital divide, the way in which access to these events changes between ages, between ethnicities, between socioeconomic groups, research on all of that stuff. And overall, access to the internet continues to grow, of course. But that's not the same thing as high-speed internet required to participate properly in events like the one that we're doing today, along with having a tablet, having a laptop with a webcam and all the rest of it. We've got a long way to go to make sure that our country is, you know, literally and figuratively up to speed in order to deal with the things that Sue was talking about. So there is a cost at the moment to all of this, and those are the things that I think are not working so well. But on the other side of it, think of the prize. This is what something that I referred to a few minutes ago. It's not cost-free moving into this sort of more digital realm, but the prize in terms of facilitating broader engagement from areas of society who have not historically been interested in or involved in what's going on in the planning system. Go along to a committee meeting, you know, an old-fashioned committee meeting, go along to a planning inquiry. It was people who could afford to take the time off if they was working, or, you know, didn't have childcare requirements or whatever it might be, didn't have a working requirements, if they were retired or whatever. The people who could afford to take that day off and go and sit there and watch us all day long. And we're very grateful to have them, but they do not, and this is speaking generally now, of course, but they do not, we weren't doing a very good job at encouraging a wide spectrum of society at showing up at these events of all sorts, plan examinations, committee meetings, inquiries. And often this sort of the sad irony of it was, particularly as someone like me who goes around the country promoting housing schemes very often, is that actually the people that I was sort of speaking on behalf of, if you like, the people who would be moving into these theoretical houses if they were to go ahead, weren't there. It was the people who were there, you know, again, speaking generally, the people who are very well represented at these events are people who already have their needs met in one way or another. And so you get a certain perspective, and the decision makers given one side of the argument, but not always so much the other side. So anyway, in the end, I think we've got a long way to go in terms of making virtual engagement work, the practicalities of it work, and those, you know, teething problems that we have had over the last year, but it's gone better than we'd expected. But overall, my view is that the prize is worth the pain, the short-term pain.
Thanks, Zack. And you mentioned actually physical infrastructure, which is one area where I completely agree with you that government needs to invest in to make it accessible to all, because actually, you know, living in the countryside, and I experience this regularly, you cannot actually improve your Wi-Fi connection in the usual way without investing huge amounts of money, sort of using satellite dishes and various modes, and that is a problem. So it's also geographical in terms of where you live and your speed of internet connection. Thank you. So Sue, coming to you, one from the floor, if that's okay, in terms of how do we balance digital planning and open data in a way that's compliant with GDPR and the principles of fairness and transparency? It's quite a very interesting question.
Yeah, I think that question was raised very specifically in the context of the information you have to supply with a planning application, which discloses personal information, so you can't share it. And I think that's actually one of the benefits of an automated submission system, because if the submission is automated, every single piece of information can be machine read or not machine read. So if you have the right software that had thought about that, and this goes back to those principles of baking it in when you procure the software, you could have a software that read the relevant parts of that planning application, but did not ever even access the personal data. So that sort of laborious job that you'd have to do by hand now as a planning officer and decide for yourself, set up properly, the machine would just go yes, no, right at the beginning and only pick up what was useful. So there are ways of doing it, but it's back to the software and it's back to the procurement of the software.
So thanks, Sue. I guess it goes on from that then in terms of what do you see the biggest threat to progress in technological advances to the planning system? Is that partly linked to the, you mentioned, didn't you, equalities, access to data, access to digital, and then that balancing? What do you see as the biggest threat to being able to advance?
I think most people would say it is the culture, and I wouldn't blame the people for this. I think we don't have the real support that we need in terms of having a government that says, okay, we like the idea of digital planning, but this is what digital planning is. Here's some specific ways in which you can help to digitalize your system. Really simple things like requiring UPRNs, like saying these are the data standards that we approve, just start adopting them. And I think a lot of the people out there trying to get planning more digital would say, if we simply had an agreed data standard, a submission requirement that the documents had to be machine readable, and a submission requirement that you include a UPRN, those three things alone would make an enormous difference to the digitalization of the system. And they're really simple.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. And it's one more for you, if you don't mind, and then I'll pass back over to Zack with a question. But it follows on from that, and you mentioned mutant algorithms, and we all saw how that can transpire into a very negative outcome last year with the examination marking. And it's a question that's come in as to say, how do you get the human interpretation of a proposal when it's a machine that's reading either your application? It doesn't actually have to just be your application data, it could be anything. And in terms of the progress of AI and automation, etc. So how do you get that? And actually, you mentioned, didn't you? It's not a mutant algorithm. It's actually stupid human.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm actually going to go back to Turing for this one. When he wrote the essay, The Imitation Game, a lot of people at the time were saying, you can't use computers, you just can't, because they're not human. And he said, well, of course, I've never asked a computer, what do you think of Picasso? Because there are some judgments that can only be made by humans. I think maybe in planning, the best example is a tree. Yeah, a machine can read a tree as a pattern recognition, and the machine can look, say, at the whole of Cambridge and could tell you very quickly how many trees there were in Cambridge. But only a human could assess what the loss of a particular tree might be. Now, I think we should use the computers for the heavy lifting, the computational aspects of trees, and also things like how much effect on air quality would planting this many trees have? Why have a human do that when a computer can do it really quickly, really easily? Which I think leaves so much more time for the human to say, okay, what's the emotional effect of planting these trees or losing these trees or putting this development up? And no computer, at least, I mean, yeah, even the most sophisticated computers so far cannot make that judgment. And I think that should always be for the human.
Yeah, I agree. It's a combination, isn't it? It's
not one or the other.
Yes, exactly. It's a balance and making it work for the best for the best of everybody. So Zack, Sue has actually mentioned just now and in her talk a number of areas that she thinks could easily be changed to help bring the planning system into the 21st century. And actually, indeed, part of the white paper proposals in terms of our plan-led system and automating and making digital the plan-led system talk about bringing partly bringing, I guess, planning system in the 21st century. What about in your view? I mean, there's been a lot of talk, we haven't really covered it, have we, in terms of local authority resource, and that was the one thing that was, it was briefly mentioned in the white paper, but it was really missing, wasn't it, in terms of, it's a comment that's commonly made actually, one of the things that slows down the planning system is the resource, but actually, is it also, in your view, upskilling and investment that was required in order to get us all up to the speed to bring the planning.
Absolutely. I mean, you've anticipated something I actually wanted to ask Sue if we had time, because obviously I came to know Sue many moons ago when Sue was at Waltham Forest in London, and so with that background, really interesting background of a very busy local authority, I'd be interested to know what, Sue, you think about the upskilling that's going to be required at an authority like that in order to, even assuming that the white paper comes forward in the terms that it's sort of envisaging at the moment, with these much more data-driven digital plans, much more visual, much shorter, you can get it on your smartphone and all of that. What kind of, how will authorities be able to grasp these opportunities without some pretty significant new investment and training? Do you have a view on that, Sue?
I'm going to be a little bit controversial and say I don't think it'll be as difficult as anybody thinks it is. I think data is a bit like land. Some of it's public, some of it's private, some of it's toxic, some of it's precious and needs to be carefully curated. Some of it can be shared, some of it must be kept private, and some of it's very valuable. We already know how to deal with a complex asset. What we do need, I think, is some maybe levels of digital skills identified, starting with these basic things about how you require a machine readable document, what the data standards are, and then take it as high as you need to go. But you know, if an old dog like me can learn about digital planning in 18 months, anybody can. It is less complicated than you think it is. The difficulty is if we ignore it.
That's really interesting. To come back, Nicholle, you asked me about the bringing the planning system up into, you know, dragging it into the 21st century, which is definitely, of all the people it's a question for, it's not a question for lawyers, that's for sure. It's the one thing I know with certainty. I mean, we know from what Sue's been telling us that this move towards data-based approaches, making the system accessible and machine readable and all of that is so incredibly important for applications, for plan policies, for the evidence base, for all of it. And I was saying to both of you earlier that I think that in some ways one of the positives of us being stuck so far into the dark ages in our planning system is that there really is so much scope for progress, so much possibility to improve, which others like Sue have been telling us about. But for me, in the end, the key to bringing our system into the 21st century is to meet people where they are, to find them, to engage them, to give them the tools to engage. And what that means for the work I do is making these events virtual, keeping them virtual, making them transparent, making them easy to interact with and to observe. I think that's huge, because unless you start with getting engagement, you know, really stretching out your hands to people and trying to bring them into the system, it's not going to be a system worth having, and certainly won't be one that's fit for this sort of brave new technological age.
We're running sort of slightly out of time, but I did want to sort of move on to Sue, if I can, and just, we've spoken a lot about the processes, the planning process, but actually what really interests me is how you take that the data and the digital and move it forward into the built environment, because actually, as I mentioned in the introduction, this has a potential to sort of fundamentally alter actually the physical environments in which we're developing and which we're building. What do you see as the government's sort of, what should be the government's main focus in this respect? We're talking about smart cities and encouragement of smart cities. Obviously, we've got the climate change emergency as well. What's your sort of take, Sue, on where the government should sort of focus its priorities?
The very most powerful use of data is where you have real-time data information merging with computational algorithms. So there's no simple. In terms of the built environment, it's just I think the most important thing is to be aware of how powerful these sensors are and what the human risks are. But in terms of the digital environment, it's about harnessing that data and making sure that it's shared in a transparent, responsible way, so that it can be merged with the physical information and the modeling tools to create these really smart outcomes. And as an example, I'm going to go back in time. Yesterday, I walked past the water pump that John Snow realized was causing a cholera epidemic in Soho. He used mathematics to work out that the epidemic was coming from that pump, and he used the built environment by simply taking the handle off the pump to stop people using it. You've got to do both with data and the environment, and it's not even that new. You know, that was 1866, so you know, it's not that difficult.
Of course, because people didn't think it would be through the water. So, yeah. No, thanks, Sue. Really good. Unfortunately, I'm afraid we are out of time now. This was an hour session. It's such a vast topic, and actually we could all talk for hours on this. But if I can just say thank you to all of our speakers. Apologies if I haven't managed to cover all of the questions. We will do our best to answer them. I guess to just close, as I've done previously, a few concluding remarks from me. I think it's clear from our discussion that this is an increasingly changing and advancing area. And I think government and local authorities, and indeed people in the industry, need to invest and upskill in order to take the maximum advantage we've got from these advances in technology. And as was mentioned earlier, this is not important just for our generation, but from future generations. And as Zack mentioned, in his experience and indeed from my experience over the last year, there has been significant increases in engagement from local communities and the general public in planning applications and local government meetings. Perhaps not always in the manner intended, as Sue mentioned, by the Jackie Weaver incident parish council meeting, or indeed actually the highly amusing, and it still makes me giggle, the cat filter in the court case in America. Absolutely brilliant. However, you know, if we do upskill and we do invest in these areas, there are huge advantages, as Zack said, that can be obtained from embracing digital planning. And we've heard this isn't just about the planning process. Actually, it's about the future of our built environment, and in relation to how we can help address the climate change emergency. As we emerge from the pandemic, that should, and I suspect will, become one of our top priorities again. So as I mentioned, it's a huge area, vast area, and we've only touched the surface today. And perhaps we might have a follow-up, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So just to say a final thank you very much to our speakers today, to Dr. Sue Chadwick and Zack Simmons, and thank you all today for joining us. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks very much.